I am Tiago Gonçalves, an airline pilot whose roots trace back to virtual aviation. Follow along as I try to make the simulation world as real as possible. Hello again and welcome back to this SOP series for A320 family. Continuing from the FMS setup, once it has been cross-checked by PM, it's time for both pilots to move to both pilots seated. This is basically when both pilots at the same time will check or set their flight instruments for the flight. This flow starts on the glare shield with the AFIS control panel. Set QNH, ISIS included for CM1, check flight directors are on, confirming that on FMA, keeping in mind flight directors are only available after AD alignment. LS off or as required. Set navigation display mode and range as required, as well as VOR ADF toggle switches. PF will also set FCU for departure. Then both pilots will check and test their respective oxygen masks, but you don't need to do like Denzel Washington on the movie Flight.
Oxygen check.
A simple test is enough, alright? Adjust the brightness on your displays, loudspeaker volume, and check your flight instruments on PFD and ND. Then your flows will have a different path. While PF confirms landing elevation auto on pressurization page and checks status page, PM will check IRS alignment on FMGS. To finish this flow, PF does a departure briefing. At the convenient stage, PM should get ATC clearance for departure. Both pilots should listen to the clearance, and while PM take note of the clearance, PF sets or checks FMGS, FCU and transponder accordingly. Then, PF will dictate the departure details by reading what was just inserted on MCDU, FCU and ATC panels, while PM cross-checks that with his notes. In case of any discrepancy, resolution is done by checking with ATC. Usually around this time, the flight crew receives the final load sheet. The tasks regarding load sheet handling are divided between CM1 and CM2 instead of PF-PM. The captain, CM1, will check all data on the load sheet and verbally dictate the zero fuel weight and zero fuel weight CG to the first officer, CM2, who's checking or updating this data on init B page together with fuel on board using the data from upper ECAM. The CM2 will then dictate the calculated takeoff weight from FMGS, while CM1 cross-checks this with load sheet. Both pilots then check or update the takeoff data on performance page. If conditions or takeoff weight changed from the preliminary calculation, then an update is required. Both need to independently calculate the performance and check if it matches, before PF inserts the data on performance page. PF leaves the FMGS on this page, performance, and PM will, after checking the data on his FMGS, select flight plan page. If you haven't started APU yet, now is a good time to do so. Once available, disconnect ground power, and this is done by PF, or PF can delegate to PM. Okay, time for checklist. PF calls for before start checklist. PM gets the checklist and challenges PF with its items. PF replies with the actual setting. PM checks if it is correct. If wrong, challenge back with correct setting, at which PF sets and then gives the appropriate answer.
Ground to cockpit, tow is driving up.
Reaching the line, PM announces the title of the checklist, followed by down to the line. In this case, before start checklist down to the line. Time to call ATC again for push and start. As you already know, PM does a radio. Once clearance is received, PF will set the external lights by turning beacon on, and PM will set the transponder for operation according to local requirements. Both pilots check windows and doors closed, slides armed, and PF continues by checking thrust levers idle, accumulator pressure green, nose wheel steering disconnect message on ECAM, and parking brake set on. PF then calls for below the line. At the end of the checklist, the PM announces the title of the checklist, followed by completed. In this case, before start checklist completed. PF then calls ground staff for pushback and start, and when the aircraft starts moving, PM starts the clock.
Starting pushback, and you may start engines.
PF starts the engines, and both pilots monitor engine parameters during start. No callouts are required. Set the engine mode selector to ignition start. These will bring the engine page on lower ECAM and power the FADEX, which in turn will broadcast engine's data to various systems and computers. Confirm this by checking the amber crosses on engine parameters extinguished. Airbus SOP says that for A320 family, start engine 2 first, because it's the one that powers the yellow hydraulic system, which pressurizes the brake accumulator. Start the engine by moving the engine master lever to on. The engine start completion is confirmed by a veil indication on N1. For the other engine, do the same.
Operation complete. Set parking brake. Disconnecting tow. Stand by.
After engine start comes the after start flow, where PF and PM will simultaneously do their flows. PM waits by PF action that will trigger his flow. Remember, PF is the leading pilot, which means PM actions and flows are mostly triggered by PF. In this case, the trigger for PM is when PF sets the engine mode to normal. PF flow goes by setting engine mode selector to normal, APU bleed off, anti-ice as required, and APU master switch as required, usually off as well. PM arms ground spoilers, reset rudder trim to 0, and set flaps and pitch trim for takeoff. Then, both pilots will check ECAM status, and PF continues by checking nose wheel steering disconnect memo not displayed anymore. And with that, can clear ground crew to disconnect.
Tow is disconnected and bypass pin has been removed. Hand signal will be on the left. We'll see you next time. Have a safe flight.
Pilots should wait for the ground crew to move away from the aircraft and check that the ground crew have the nose wheel steering pin as they have to show it to the pilots, as well as a nice thumbs up. Reply back with a thumbs up as well, and PF then calls for after start checklist. This is how task sharing with multi-crew works. taxi and takeoff phase coming up soon on next video. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you learned something new today. Subscribe, share and comment below if you have any question. See you next time. You have controls.